Internet Governance Academic Network, or GigaNet. Apologies to anyone here. Any feedback from my voice? I think it's okay now. All right. We also have another distinguished speaker, Mrs. Sita Laxmi. Hello, Mbak Sita. Sita Laxmi is the Executive Director of TIPA Foundation. She's also a certified data protection officer from European Center on Privacy and Cybersecurity from Maastricht University. Sita holds 2 master's degrees, first one in journalism from Ateneo de Manila University of the Philippines, and the second one is the master in contemporary diplomacy, specifically internet governance from the University of Malta. She has 20 years of experience of work, where in 2017 and 2019, she was a project manager for Asia at Diplo Foundation and an expert team member with the ICT Applications Directorate General under the Indonesian Ministry of Information and Communication Technologies. Shita also worked with HIFOS previously, where she managed a regional program on technology and transparency in 6 countries within Southeast Asia. From 2014 and 16, Shita also served as a member of the MAG, or Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group at the United Nations, to advise the Secretary General on the Internet Governance Forum meetings. Welcome, Shita. Our third speaker is Mrs. Amrita Choudhury. I hope I pronounced that right, Amrita. We are honored to have you here. Amrita is the director of CCAOI, an organization representing the interest of internet users and non-users in India. She is also an active participant in tech policy discussions, both at the domestic and international platforms. She's involved in capacity building, outreach, and research in internet governance. She is also the president of Internet Society Delhi chapter, the member of UN-IGF MAG. We have 2 members of the stakeholder advisory groups. Very exciting. And she's also the vice chair of Asia Pacific Regional IGF, heads of the Asia Pacific Women's Special Internet Group in Internet Society, and is the nominating committee of 2021 member at ICANN. She is also one of the founding members of the India School of Internet Governance, curates the Geneva Internet Platform, and advises and guides youth at IGF, a youth outreach initiative in India, and rural SIG at Internet Society. Welcome, Amrita. And we also have Professor Pirongrong Ramasutta. Welcome, Pirongrong. Professor Pirongrong is the Professor of Communication at the Faculty of Communication of Arts, Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. Her research and teaching focus on media policy, regulations, and social implications of information and communication technologies, with a special focus on Thailand and ASEAN. Her past published works range from online game, hate speech, online intermediary, echo chamber, to over-the-top or OTTs regulations. Dr. Ramasutta was given the Nationally Distinguished Researcher Award from the National Research Council of Thailand in 2017 and was on the board of several international think tanks such as Asian Media Information and Communication Center, Privacy International, I worked there once, and Communication Policy Research South, or CPR South. Pirongrong also had trainings in media law and regulation from Oxford University and the London School of Economics and Political Science. So yeah, that's a very stellar profiles of our speakers. Now we can move on to I think the committee has some video to play. Please, Panitia, silakan. Okay, thank you so much and welcome again to all participants dialing in offsite or online. So before we start, by way of introduction, let me suggest we paddle back to the late 2020 and early 2021, corresponding with the US presidential election, where this debate of intermediaries, in particular social media, should be held accountable from content provided by the user are increasingly being talked about. As you may know, we have several existing principles relating to intermediary accountability. We have the Manila Principles and also Section 230 of the Communication Decency Acts of the US, and also the Digital Safety Acts in the EU. And we also today would like to seek and identify the global trends of intermediary liability, especially from the EU and US context, and how it influences countries in Asia in governing their social media. And we can also elaborate further on the discussions between publisher versus non-publisher question. So it's time for a deep dive on the issues, and perhaps we can do this in an interactive way. Please, if other speakers wanted to chime in on the conversation or have questions or anything, please feel free to do so. But to start, let me go with a question to Dr. Roxana Radu to help us setting up the tone. Dr. Radu, from a global perspective, what do you think are the trends on content moderation and internet intermediary liability look like? And what do you think about the implementation so far? Dr. Radu, floor is yours.
Thank you, Denisa. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone from Geneva. It's a true pleasure to be here and join this session and be virtually connected to Bali. Last time I was there, it was in 2013 when I was participating in the Global Internet Governance Forum. So it's great to be back at the regional IGF this time, and I would like to congratulate the organizers for this year's program. Going back to Dinita's questions, my intervention will focus on three major trends that I consider to be the most important when it comes to content moderation and intermediary liability. And I'm hoping that by discussing these trends, we also understand better how content moderation and intermediary liability are connected and why it is worth discussing them together. First, I'll talk a little bit about the origins and the trend of self-regulation, followed by a quick look at the labor dimension of this discussion, the people who work to have our content curated online, and finally going into an overview of some of the regulatory initiatives in the EU at the moment. So let me start with a little bit of history. We have always had this hands-off approach.
Recording in progress. Recording stopped.
To regulation of platforms. So let me start again because I hear there is a recording happening. So historically, the hands-off approach to regulation has been in place, and it has to do with the fact that the US has passed in 1996 a particular set of regulations as part of the Telecommunications Act, which included a section on communications decency. And part of this was Section 230, and in there we find one of the most important provisions for information intermediaries in the history of the internet, namely the protection from liability for the online actions of their users. The Section 230 that is still valid today stresses that no provider or users of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So in a few words, whatever a user does online remains a responsibility that can be with the user but not with the platform as such. With very few limitations in place for criminal and intellectual property-based claims, these regimes for the protection of intermediaries remain in place, and it's really the cornerstone of what we see today as a private governance of this space. Being the first country to introduce protections against liability for online platforms, the US was in a very good position to actually attract most initiatives for creating, or startups, if you want, at that point in time, for creating such platforms. And what we see today is a result of this open culture, where most of the large platforms are based in the US and follow the US legislation. So Silicon Valley is a result of that. We see it as a hub of high-tech innovation. Behind it is really the power given to the platforms by Section 230. So with that in mind, of course, the picture nowadays looks a bit different, because we also have a number of Chinese platforms that are highly influential. And we see, even at the national level, in some cases, platforms that have lots of users. So the question of how we move on from a no regulation space to a somehow regulated space is really extremely important today. And it has to do with liability on the one hand, but it also has to do with moderation of content, because we are no longer speaking today of a space in which platforms have no responsibility for the content. And we've seen this through a few moves of self-regulation. Platforms have already tried to set up their own standards for it. One attempt was the enforcement of community standards. These are sets of guidelines that platforms put together, generally by themselves, although sometimes they do that in consultation with different communities, actual communities of users, that is. Otherwise, they do it from their own offices. So Facebook had something of this kind, where they had 11 offices of theirs consulted in the process, but that remained Facebook officials working on the policy and not users themselves. So the guidelines are generally revised, and they are implemented through content moderation activities. But the question has been posed many, many times, the question of actually getting input from the communities that get regulated in this way. At the moment, for example, platforms like Facebook have more than 2 billion users. And in the case of Facebook, the largest part of users come from India. But the Indian population is not generally consulted in the design of such community standards, which are then imposed strictly on everybody in India. So the question is, should there be a different approach? Should there be more of a tailoring to the local content and the local context for these types of community standards? And then there is the question of how this come to be implemented. So on the one hand, we've seen the rollout of technical features that can address harmful content, and a lot of them include automated processes. And on the other hand, there has been often a reference that platforms have made to the possibility of flagging. So this is the process in which a user clicks to inform a platform that some content is illegal or not desirable on their platform. So we have, on the one hand, automation and AI tools, artificial intelligence tools, and on the other hand, the possibility of users to flag content. Now, looking at statistics, the possibility of flagging is not necessarily the one that is most used. And here we have very different percentages across the world, but just to give you two figures, in the EU, it's never more than 30% of action being taken based on flagging. So it's still a minority of cases when flagging is actually used. But if we look at Africa, it's less than 3%. So we can discuss whether this is really an approach that can move forward the content moderation discussion. On the other hand, we've seen a lot of effort being put into artificial intelligence policing the content, and that has led to quite worrisome situations in which AI detects content before it's even loaded on and published on somebody's page, and does not allow for it to be published. So there are these extreme cases, or cases in which the artificial intelligence algorithms do not identify humor or sarcasm in some of the content and block it without giving users the possibility to challenge that decision. So we have, let's say, a full spectrum of problems associated with the way in which platforms have started to self-regulate on the matter. And to this, we have to add the global dynamic of the increasing power of platforms. They are not small players anymore. We're talking about billions of users. And the amount of content being uploaded is also on the rise. In a minute, we have thousands of videos up, we have thousands of posts up, and maybe even closer to millions. And it's becoming a large-scale problem. But it's also about where we express our thoughts and how we're using these platforms as the public sphere, because at the end of the day, a lot of our activities are simply only happening online. So in that sense, we've seen a debate recently around the extent to which platforms can be considered public space and the extent to which they have to follow regulations, just like television or radio sources before them. So in terms of oversight, there's really been little over time. I think we can say clearly that historically the oversight has been missing for platforms, especially very large platforms. And the recent attempts to impose supervision on platforms are met with a lot of reactions. One of them was coming from Facebook itself. It was the Facebook Oversight Board. It's an initiative that Facebook put in place in order to handle appeals for blocked and removed content. And many commentators have referred to this as the Facebook Supreme Court. So instead of having an independent body that can look at the decisions of Facebook, Facebook is creating an internal body, although it has some independence from Facebook itself, at least that is the claim, that can oversee its own decisions. And in the beginning, this was really presented as a model that Twitter could take forward, that TikTok could take forward. Now there are more and more questions arising, especially after some of the contradictory discussions happening in the oversight board around the suppression of posts from President Trump. And then I would say, when it comes to how other parts of the world have reacted to this, we haven't really seen a lot of change. So on the one hand, we have the US trend that is very clear. But for example, in Europe, the European authorities have preferred working with voluntary commitments from platforms when it came to countering illegal hate speech online and disinformation. So they adopted, together with major platforms, the code of conduct for illegal hate speech and the code of practice on disinformation, where platforms are regularly reporting on their progress. But it has to do with the actions that they take themselves, obviously in line with the guidelines from the European Commission, but it remains an activity that is purely voluntary. So this is what we have seen on the self-regulation trend. And I'd like to go quickly into the invisible face of content moderation, which is the human labor behind it, and then come back to the move to regulate platforms in the European Union. So when it comes to the human labor, we've seen, probably most of you have seen some of these videos that present workers in what looks like almost a sweatshop in very poor conditions, looking at videos every minute They, in fact, have about 1 minute to review content. There are thousands of decisions to be made in a day, and the humans who look at the screens all day have to decide in accordance with the guidelines. Sometimes these are community guidelines, sometimes these are local regulations, whether a content can stay up or needs to be taken down. And this has been on the rise as well. More and more content moderators are employed every day. But the question of their contract is quite important, because a lot of them are not really considered employees of the major platforms. They are contractors of an intermediary that will then handle their work conditions. And as we know, these are not necessarily very good work conditions. Additionally, being a content moderator comes with a lot of risks. People get exposed to, if you want, the worst of humanity online, and they have to face many of these instances on a daily basis without really getting the right support for it. It's a very intense job that exposes somebody to the worst out there. And without the necessary support, a lot of them really suffer from depression. It's a job that is currently classified as one of the worst jobs to have in the world. In this role, people do not stay more than 1 or 2 years. It's really extremely harsh to do such a job. And the question has been whether platforms are doing enough when it comes to the human labor, to treating these people with respect, to allowing them enough time to reflect on the decisions they have to take, rather than pushing a number of decisions on them on a daily basis to meet a quota of content they have to review. And also whether they can, at the end of the day, work alongside AI solutions to make their job easier, or even to simply cope with the amount of work they have every day. And we don't really have an answer to this. And unfortunately, regulation is not really coming to this space immediately. These discussions are not that much in the focus, but I think there is media attention to this side of the problem, and hopefully this will result down the line into some action being taken. So now when we look at regulation, and I'll turn to what is happening in the EU, we are seeing that a move to hold platforms accountable for illegal content or legal content that is not desirable is currently profiling itself. So we are seeing a move towards regulation. The EU, also referred to sometimes as the regulator of the digital space, is obviously one of the first ones to actually impose strict regulations. And we've seen this with the initiative of the European Commission around the Digital Services Act. This act is currently under discussion. It's a proposal that has passed the European Commission, but is now with the Parliament and Member States, and it's currently being negotiated. So we'll see how many of the initial provisions will stay the same in the final adoption. But the idea with the Digital Services Act is to provide, for the first time in a harmonized way at the European level, rules for online intermediary services along a number of distinctions, but basically covering everything from internet access providers to online marketplaces and social media platforms. And the Digital Services Act will not function in a vacuum. It will actually come alongside the e-commerce directive that was giving immunity to platforms for user-generated content, and alongside the General Data Protection Regulation, which was providing strong protection for users, including, for example, when it came to asking for algorithmic transparency. So we will see how all of these pieces of legislation will work together when the Digital Services Act is out and enforced. And this specific piece of regulation introduces rules, interestingly, for the first time, for very large platforms. They actually call it specific rules for very large online platforms that reach more than 10% of the 450 million consumers in Europe. And for the first time, users will have legal safeguards in place and the possibility to challenge content moderation decisions via legal process. There's also an increased transparency obligation for online platforms, including on algorithms used for recommendations. And there will be independent audits for how very large platforms manage the risk associated with online content. So hopefully some sort of external means of control will be in place once the regulation reaches its final version, and we'll be able to get more insight, because part of the problem so far has been that platforms operate in a lot of opacity. So it's very difficult to understand some of the practices unless you're an insider, and regulators have had very little access to how these platforms operate. And finally, and I think quite importantly, there will be, with the Digital Services Act, an overall regulatory supervision of content hosts. And this will be at multiple levels. First, the EU member states will have designated agencies that users can report to. Then there's going to be a new European board for digital services. And for very large platforms, the EU Commission can intervene. Including by imposing fines and so on, similar to what they've done with the General Data Protection Regulation. So I think we are on the right track with getting some degree of accountability when it comes to the operation of platforms, but we'll have to wait for the final version of the Digital Services Act to understand exactly. Here and give the floor back to Dimitar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raju, for highlighting the trends, especially in the US and EU, and also noting on the platform's attempt to self-regulate, such as the Facebook Oversight Board. And I appreciate you bring up the topic of content moderation process, especially the human labor part of it, which sometimes being forgotten. This opens up the door to explore the current state of intermediary liability in Indonesia, which context is different, but I understand that most of our digital related regulations are inspired by the US and the EU. And I'd like to invite Mrs. Shita Laxmi to share her thoughts. Please, Masita. I remember you have a presentation for this.
Yeah, yes, okay, well, thank you very much, Ria. I hope you can hear me, and it is very honored to be in the panel with all of these women, because I'm really admiring the works of Roxana, Amrita, and Verongrong from afar. So I will try to share my my presentation. Can you see it? My presentation? Yeah. So when Roxana is explaining about the trend, I would like specifically to talk about the internet intermediary in Indonesia. So this is really Indonesian based, and I think there are so many participants from Indonesia as well. So in my interpretations, the internet intermediary is broadly defined as an entity which provides services from one point to another on the internet. It could be in the form of infrastructure access to the internet and or facilitating two or more points in transfer of data process. This is my interpretation. So APC was making a definition as well. So they are differentiating the internet intermediary into two issues. One is as a conduits, which is the only technical providers of internet access or transmission services. So conduits do not interfere with content they are transmitting. It's like an internet service provider. And host is providers of the content services, for instance, online platform and storage services. So they gave more weight on the content services. These are the relevant regulations in Indonesia. So we have Telecommunication Act in 1999, but it was changed into Job Creation Act in 2020. We have Copyright Act in 2014, basically relating to the role of internet intermediary in disseminating copyright infringement materials. So the liability or the responsibility for the internet intermediary intermediary is that the relevant minister can request to block access, either part of the content or hold the whole content up to closing down a site. In terms of closing down a site, the minister should ask for the court decision. So this is a copyright act. Up to in year 2020, the Ministry of Communication have taken down around 3,000 content which infringe the copyright materials. And in 2021, and earlier 2021, they have taken down around 360 content related to the copyright infringement. The second one is the Electronic Transformation and Transaction, or ITE law. This is a very famous and a cornerstone of the information and transactions law in Indonesia. It was made in 2016, but it's changed in 2008, but it was changed in 2016. The internet intermediary, in my interpretations, is defined as electronic system operator, or in Indonesia, penyelenggara sistem elektronik. So in 2008, the definition was an electronic system operator is the use of electronic system by the state administrators, persons, business entity, and or the public. In 2016, it's being revised into any person, state administrator, business entity, and public that provides, manage, and or operate the electronic system individually or jointly to electronic system user for their own needs and or purposes of other party. So if we are comparing with the APC definition, it consists of both as a conduit and also as a host. So this law is mainly about electronic certifications, electronic signature, but they also have these definitions and many sanctions towards the illegal content. We go down a bit, we have this very famous government regulation number 71, 2019, Electronic System and Transaction Operations, because this is kind of like a comprehensive regulation in Indonesia, which actually differentiate between public and private electronic system operators or internet intermediary in Indonesia. I call it operators to make it easy. Which consists of accountability and obligations of the operators, personal data protection principles, location of data, registry of the operators, and electronic signature. We also have the ministerial regulations number 2020 in 2016, which mainly about personal data protections and obligation for the operators to act based on the personal data protection principles. The newest one is the private electronic system operator. This is basically governing private operators, or basically governing the platforms, governing the internet intermediary and private, yeah. So it has, it gives mandatory for the operators in managing their content, including their user-generated content. Last but not least is the regulations made by National Cyber and Crypto Agency, which is basically on the information security management system certifications. So it's basically a very technical. They have the discussions on the availability of the expert staff member and also the ISO certifications. The newest one is this police guidelines on cyber crimes related to COVID-19. So it was established in April. So the police issued an internal memo that provide guidelines for the police on how to handle cyber crimes during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if the police can do based on the criminal code for anyone insulting the president and other top officials in relation to the COVID-19 policies, will be charged under criminal code, or anyone spreading false information related to the government policies in handling COVID-19. This is also can be subjected to the criminal code. So if we see how Indonesia is doing, in my point of view, we have these laws, yeah, internet intermediary or electronic system operators. We have the ITE law as the source. We also have this government regulations number 71 in 2019. We also have these personal data protections in 2016. We have the newest one in 2020 on private electronic system operations. We also have this agency regulation on the security system, and the newest one is the police internal memo for COVID-19 response. I would like to go a bit deep dive on the ministerial regulations number 5 2020, because it is very interesting. It is basically what they define as the actors or as the operations is the governed by a specific sector or any operations that has functions in commerce, financial transactions, transferring data or digital materials through data network, communication services, search engine, and processing personal data. This also includes user-generated platform. What is interesting is the obligations for the actors. It should be registered in Indonesia. It should not violate the provision of laws and regulations. It should not disturbing public and public order. It should not provide tools and access to prohibited information or illegal content. It should give access to personal data they are processing to the government or authority when it is deemed necessary for monitoring and criminal law enforcement. There's also a safe harbor provided for the actors, for the operators, that has then actions to prevent the dissemination of illegal content. The types of sanction is like written warning, temporary suspension, access blocking, and takedown content, and the fine. What is very interesting is there was a huge feedback on this regulation, mainly by the human rights organization. SafeNet has asked government to scrap these regulations. Yeah, Human Rights Watch also sent significant feedback on this, which received a lot of applause from many human rights activists and scholars. And the government then decided to postpone the registrations. So basically, the registration deadline was in June 2021. Now the government decided to postpone it to December 2021 to make sure that they have a good mechanism in place. I think what is unique from these regulations is that this regulation is also based on complaints. Yeah, so the minister could, the complaints could come from public, from the ministry or authority or law enforcement and the court. So anyone can complain on the content. So basically based, if I don't like Ria posting in Facebook, for example, I can ask Facebook to take down, or I can ask the government of Indonesia to take down Ria's post on Facebook. So basically anyone can ask. And also there is a timeline, yeah, for urgent requests such as terrorism, child pornography, and disturbing public and public order. The request could be only 4 hours. So when the request came, then the platforms or the operators should take down or should block the access in 4 hours. If the platforms do not want to take down the content, then the government can go to the internet service provider to block the access, in which the internet service provider will have to obey. If not, then there will be sanctions. So this is a very interesting for discussions on the regulations, like what happened in EU perhaps. Some key highlights. This is my last slide. So in Indonesia, the definition of internet intermediary is basically PSE, penyelenggara sistem elektronik or electronic system operator. Any person, state administrator, business entity, and public that provides, manage, and or operate the electronic system individually or jointly to electronic system users for their own needs and purpose for other party. In translations, it could be platforms, public and private, content provider, content creator, individuals, and internet service provider. And the range of issues is also very wide, yeah, starting from copyright infringement, illegal content, violate decency, gambling content, insult and defamation. Sorry, I'm living next to the mosque, so you will hear azan here. So I hope you don't mind. And also extortion threat, false informations, hoax, incitement of hatred based on ethnicity, race, religion, and group, insulting the president regarding COVID-19 policies, spreading false news about COVID-19, and security of personal data protection. So there are many range of issues related to the intermediary liability. The types of sanctions is written warning, imprisonment, fine, blocking the content, take down the content, and take down site. In my point of view, based on the news and based on the conversations that we have with the regulators, most of the type sanctions that they are doing is blocking the content or take down the content. I think this is my presentation, Ria. I'm going to stop share.
Thank you, Mbak Sita, for the comprehensive explanations on the regulation landscape in Indonesia. So can we say that we do have several regulations in place to hold intermediary accountable, also with sanctions available, but since it is based on complaint, I think the implementation will also be interesting / problematic. Okay, I'd like to touch on that point about intermediary liability and applying a lens that is specific to India. So Amrita, how would you describe the evolution of intermediary rules in India? And perhaps you can also have any thoughts about what Roxana said about how Facebook is not consulting the users in India to create their standard. Please, Amrita.
Thank you, Dinita. And hello, everyone. Happy to be here. Before I give the India story, certain points and threads which you will see common across the globe, where, we have different issues, different ways in which we use the internet, but certain things which are common is, one of the main things is that we live in a digital world. Most of the things which we do today are online. Very new users are coming online using social media, especially YouTube or Facebook or even messaging platforms without actually knowing how to use. There is a lot of information flowing, misinformation, fake news, etc., which people believe a lot, and not only and companies are grappling with these issues because even they don't understand how to deal with it, because it's not only content which is being posted, it is content in different languages which is being posted, and the interpretation is different. Similarly, if it is, for example, someone writing in English, a Hindi content, it will mean completely different. So algorithms or even humans in different places really don't know, it may seem very simple, however, that particular sentence may have very deep meanings. So even companies are grappling with these issues. And simultaneously, if you look at it, governments are trying to grapple with this issue. We have some, as Roxana mentioned, we have some companies which are US-based following US laws. But there are local issues, and those issues which come up need resolution at the earliest. Which at times doesn't happen. MLATs take a lot of time. Bilaterals are not so strong to get issues resolved. And there are different kinds of issues you have. It ranges from child pornography to terrorist content to all kinds of hate speech. Of course, hate speech is again very it depends. I may find it as hate speech, someone may not find it as hate speech. I may want Facebook to take down a content, but again some others may feel that that content should not be taken down. So there are diverse views which comes into play, and all governments, and that's the essence which I find from the EU rules, or even what Shita mentioned in Indonesia, is that the governments want the companies to be accountable to the law of the land. Because there is a concern which comes out that, look, they follow a different rule in US, whereas when it comes to other countries, they do not follow the same rules. So they say, why don't the companies follow the same kind of rules? And they have become huge. Even the governments realize today that the power of these companies are huge, and they really don't know how to tackle this. And the only way they find that they can tackle with them is through regulations. Whether that's going to work in the times to come, we will actually have to see. But these are certain threads which are going on, and I think most governments are looking at each other to see how each one's regulations are working and trying to take things. Initially, the inspirations were US and EU, but now they're looking at neighbors also. So these are certain, I would say these are certain things which are happening globally. And obviously the manifestations in different countries are coming in different ways. Now, having said that, if I look at the India story, we have an exciting, I would say, lots of things happening here, primarily because we have the second largest internet population in the world at this point of time. As Roxana mentioned, we have the largest Facebook users. Twitter, I think we are third or fourth largest users. WhatsApp is prevalent, as in it's rapidly used, though we have only 30, we don't even have 40% of our people connected online, but we are one of the huge consumers. We are their big market, and we see a lot of issues coming. There have been posts which have circulated, which have so-called resulted in a person being, people being lynched because those were fake news. So those are issues, and it's justified. Countries also, governments also want to grapple with these kind of issues and see how they can stop it. But what happens is very different. So if I go back to the India internet story and the intermediary liabilities, so presently in India we have different rules and sub legislations which are governing intermediaries, and the rules at this moment, the intermediary could be a Facebook or a Google, it could be even a cyber cafe. So the terminology of intermediary is really broad. It's not narrow, but and that's something which is still prevalent. So it started with the IT Act in 2000, which initially looked at only network service providers as intermediaries. However, no safe harbor protection was given to them. But what happened after that was there was a case which is very famous called Bazi.com, wherein the managing director of a company called Bazi.com, it was an online site, and not the company, was actually charged with criminal provisions for a content which was circulated by a third party on its e-commerce platform. So what had happened is there was a clip, there was a person from who had posted a pornographic clip, and some people started buying it, and that was the actual issue. However, what happened was the managing director was made liable. Is there an echo?
Yes, I can hear an echo as well. Komati, can you check on the sound? Anyone? Yes, we can still hear the echo. Operator, perhaps? Operator, kalau bisa dicek suaranya supaya tidak echo.
Yeah, let me try now. I think it's better.
It's okay now.
Okay. So what happened is the MD was made accountable and not the company. So ultimately, what happened is, since the managing director escaped the liability because the company was not held accountable for this, and then the courts observed that the companies bear the risk of acquiring knowledge if the content uploaded escapes the filters which are meant for blocking pornographic content. So in this context, in this case, it was observed that there is a requirement for widening the scope of protection given to intermediaries, and that is when the IT Act was amended in 2008 to include the safe harbor. And there was a special section called Section 79, which was added, and the definition was amended, in the Act. So after that, what happened is in 2000, after the amendment of the IT Act in 2008, the government introduced the intermediary guidelines in 2011, where which made mandatory for all intermediaries to follow certain safeguards to actually ensure they have the safe harbor protection. For example, intermediaries need to publish rules and regulations, privacy policy, user agreement, regulations and regulations, terms and conditions of user agreement, and also take down content within 36 hours of getting a notice, provide assistance to authorized government agencies, report cybersecurity incidents, etc. However, what it was found that, the IT Act and the intermediary guidelines had various issues coming up, and there was ambiguity in the rules in terms of what content is prohibited, how the decisions are being taken, who can request to take down unlawful content, etc. And then what happened was there was a landmark judgment, which we call as the Shreya Singhal case in 2015, wherein the Supreme Court for the first time recognized that the right of free speech in over the internet for citizens, and it struck down a particular section in the IT Act, which was called as 66A, which provided punishment for sending offensive message through communication services. So what happened is, if I posted something and you found it offensive and you put in a litigation under section 66A, it would be taken down. So this was struck down by the Supreme Court, and this and what happened was, at the at the present moment, section 79A of the IT Act actually is the intermediary guidelines, and the Shreya Singhal was thing which is the authoritative law, in terms of intermediary liability. And it was also mentioned that intermediaries cannot be held liable unless they have proper information, and unless, if after takedown they have not taken down the content. However, it was also stated that need to demonstrate due diligence. So this was how it happened. However, over time it was seen that the lack of transparency of the platforms, their accountability, the growth in a lot of pornographic content, harmful content online, especially child pornography, etc., was growing, and there was a lot of tension which was growing. So, the Supreme Court in a particular case called Prajwala observed that the government actually needs to frame certain guidelines to eliminate child pornography, rape, gang rape, imageries, videos, etc. from content platforms. Simultaneously, the Supreme Court also asked the Ministry of Electronics that what they are doing and by when they will have new rules formed. There was also a lot of discussion in the Rajya Sabha, which is the parliament, on fake news, and they also asked the government to strengthen legal frameworks to make social media platforms accountable. There was an ad hoc committee in the Rajya Sabha which actually took up the case of the alarming growth of pornography, especially child pornography, and the need for trying to identify the first originator of the content. So these were certain backgrounds which actually made the government release the new rules, which is called as the Indian Information Technology Rules 2021, or the Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Media Ethics Code, which actually came into, which was formed early this year. And what this did was it became applicable especially on social media companies online, the streaming companies like the Netflixes and others, and digital news media. So what this rule did was it introduced a new terminology which is called as significant social media intermediaries. In those intermediaries which have more than 5 million users, and they have to have some additional diligence. They need to observe, like, for example, have a physical office in India, appoint a 24/7 nodal officer to assist law enforcement agencies, set up a grievance officer, publish monthly transparency report of number of complaints received, action taken, content taken down. It also introduced traceability of the first originator of the message. However, it mentioned that there is no need to share the entire content other than the information about where it originated. In case the message originated overseas, the rules suggest that the traceability of the first Indian originator can be demanded. The rules also, suggest use of automated tools to take down content, voluntary verification of users, explicit grievance redressal and takedown policies, such as acknowledging the complaint within 24 hours and dispose of such complaints within a period of 15 days from receipt of these complaints, retain the user data after ceasing service for at least 180 days, and need to keep content takedown data also for 180 days. It also introduces criminal liability of intermediaries. Now, if you look at the Digital Media Ethics Code, which is applicable for online news platforms, OTT platforms, and digital media, it talks about following the code of ethics. And for online streaming platforms, it defines who is an online curated platform, who can be a publisher of online curated content. It calls for self-classification of content, including age ratings depending on the content, a three-tier complaint mechanism system, wherein first it is by the streaming service, then with the self-regulatory authority where a judge can be heading it or some eminent personality, and lastly by the government committee, and it mandates the appointment of a grievance redressal officer who is resident in India. And the need to register with a self-regulatory organization, which in turn could be registered with the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. And all decisions at the governmental level, such as deleting or censoring content, is subject to the approval of the Information and Broadcasting Secretary, and the Secretary has emergency blocking powers. So similarly, if you look at the digital media and publishers, they need to comply with the codes under the Press Council for Journalists and Program Code under the Cable TV Networks Act. They also have to have a similar three-tier redressal mechanism and they also have to publish compliance reports. Now, after this was released, there were certain pluses that companies had to be more accountable, they had to have a grievance mechanism, etc. But there were certain concerns also raised. For example, Supreme Court felt that the OTT regulations which were being drafted was not adequate and there should be more norms in it. The Delhi court again challenged the new IT guidelines while the Supreme Court stayed it. There was the Special Branch of Human Rights Council in the UN who expressed concerns of the India's IT Act, saying that the rules do not conform with the international human rights norms. But this was again, the Indian Permanent Mission of India clarified that the rules were finalized post stakeholder discussion, and it is designed to empower ordinary people. It is reported that several industry organizations have expressed concerns about the criminal liability imposed on intermediaries, and I'll come to an example later in the IT rules, especially because they feel it is detrimental to the ease of doing business for companies. Now, the rule has also been challenged in the court by Facebook and WhatsApp, and especially because the end-to-end encryption part, wherein it talks about tracing the first originator of the information, and because Facebook says that it is fundamentally against the right of privacy of people, and they also explain why the traceability is difficult. However, the government responded saying that while it respects the right to privacy and it does not have any intention to violate it, however, when Facebook discloses the origin, however, right to privacy is not absolute. So this is still on. Similarly, there was a case filed by a news portal called Leaflet, which says, the present rules are violative of the right to equality, freedom of speech and expression, freedom of practice of any profession or occupation, trade or business. The Press Trust of India has filed a writ petition saying that it violates the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution of India, and it can usher in an era of surveillance, fear, and censorship. And there were other few cases.
Apologize. Can you hold that thought so we can discuss about the freedom of expressions after Pirangrong shared the view?
Right. Thanks.
Thank you, Amrita, for reminding us that companies are also facing difficulties in dealing with the issues, as they have to follow different rules in different country. And Amrita also give us a useful overview and background of the new intermediary guidelines and digital media ethics code in India. Perhaps it will be interesting to discuss how the rules be applied in the context of freedom of expression, and we can discuss it later. Now I will turn to Professor Pirongrong Ramasuta. Hello, Pirongrong, are you there? Yes.
Here. Hi.
Hello. How would you react to what you heard so far, Pirongrong, and what can you bring from the Thailand perspectives to the discussion?
Okay, I have quite a different experience in Thailand, and I will make a key takeaway at the end. Can I go to my slides? I just start my screen.
Yes.
Oops. Oops. Oh, I can't seem to share.
Let me just check with the.
Okay, it shows that one participant can share at a time. So somebody will have to stop sharing, I guess.
Panitia, boleh tolong dicek? Pirongrong mau share screen-nya? Mungkin ada yang lagi share screen? Bisa diberhentikan dulu agar Pirongrong bisa. Halo. Panitia, halo. Can you do it now, Pirongrong?
Izin Bu Dinita, tidak ada yang share screen dan
yes,
Ibu
now
Pirongrong
can. Yep.
bisa share screen karena co-host. Terima kasih.
Okay. Okay, can you see?
Yes.
Can you go to the screen? Okay. Okay. Well, I wrote on intermediary liability a few years ago, and quite a few things have changed for Thailand. We have a law which sort of represents this specifically designed governance system for intermediaries in Thailand with a clause on intermediary liability in section 15. And anyway, this crime has been, this law has been amended in 2017, 10 years after it was enacted. And quite a significant change has been made. I mean, the penalty is still the same, and the content offenses are still pretty much the same. You know, it includes like false data that could cause public panic, public infrastructure, public security, economic security, and pornographic data, that kind of thing. But okay. But in 2017, as I said, an amendment has been made to the law, and also there has been a ministerial order added onto it. And under this ministerial order, a safe harbor has been added. And so under this safe harbor for service providers, so long as they prove that they have been compliant to the rule that is set out by the ministerial order, and which specify very clearly that they have to remove any illegal content within 7 days, instantaneously, or within 7 days under very difficult circumstances. And if they could prove that they did not, that is elements of dishonesty and deceit, if they could prove that there is no dishonesty and deceit involved, then they would be off the hook. Okay, so that's like a better news, but not entirely good news, because I mean the liability provision is still there for the service providers. Okay. Anyway, generally speaking, apart from the provision on intermediary liability, there are also general notice and takedowns. And usually this notice and takedown will involve such content offenses as lèse majesté, which Thailand is very renowned for. And more recently, since the coup in 2014, we have become a national security state. So any anti-government criticism could be construed as threats to national security as well. And of course, most recently, fake news and disinformation. Okay, in context, local intermediaries, websites, and ISPs generally comply with the in, intermediary liability provision, but global platforms like Facebook and Twitter selectively comply because they're not under the jurisdiction of Thai law. Um, Apart from objectionable content, copyright was also a problem before the amendment of the law. Much of the takedown was also as a result of alleged copyright infringement. But after the safe harbor law was clause was added in 2017, most of the intermediaries seem to be exempted from that charge. Okay. Apart from the Computer Crime Act, or the CCA, as we call it for short, we also have this new notification, which is equivalent to the ministerial order. And this only came out very recently, just on about a couple of weeks ago, less than a couple of weeks ago. And this has to do with data retention. This has imposed quite a big burden on intermediaries. Before, according to the old, the CCA, prior to the amendment, it was 90 days. But now, according to this order, it became 6 months, and actually the maximum period would be up to 2 years, which is and that's a lot of burden in terms of social media platforms, especially to retain all the data. And this is under the circumstance that if there's anything to suspect that certain crimes may be committed, on the platforms, and these are the platforms that they actually list. These are the list of the service providers. Before, it would be just mainly ISPs, the telecom providers. These are the old categories, service providers. But then the additional categories are the online applications and social media servers, and also cloud computing services. And these are listed in the order specifically. Okay, and also we have had a lot since COVID-19 became a global pandemic, and Thailand had to have lockdown and many prevention and control measures. The emergency decree was invoked, as in many other places, in highly infectious zones, and as a result of the launch of this emergency decree, specific regulation to curb so-called disinformation and fake news was also added. But anyway, it was so ambiguous, and it was here. This is what it reads. It's called Regulation 29, which was passed under the provision of the emergency decree. It's say here that any distorted information which causes misunderstanding of the emergency situation to the extent that it affects security of state, public order, good morals to people, and whatever may instigate fear among the people would have to be prosecuted. And the way they block, the way that they're trying to block such speech is by having the country's communication regulator ban IP address. So ISPs would have to look into this speech that are objectionable legally, and then find the URL address and the IP addresses of people who posted it. But anyway, a group of people, myself included, we went to the court and went to the civil court and asked for an injunction and that's what we got. And eventually, the government backed down. Okay, let's move on to the question of compliance, platform compliance. As I said earlier, global platforms don't really care about all this government curbing measure against free speech. Facebook said, well, we may comply, but we're also going to sue the government for contravening international human rights law. Okay, so the non-compliant clearly suggests that Facebook is acting more as publisher of data rather than, because they have clear self-governance and content moderation policy rather than being just platform. Okay, this is an excerpt from a piece of news on this, that the DES is the host of the Computer Crime Law, stands for the Digital Economic and Society Ministry of Digital Economy and Society. Okay, and this is it makes it to the international news in CNN that Facebook was preparing legal action against the Thai government because there was a group on Facebook that is clearly anti-monarchy, and this is a big issue, as you know, in Thailand. And this group has accumulated more than 200,000 followers on Facebook. It's called a Royalist Marketplace, with a very sarcastic name. Anyway, and here, this news also shows that Facebook don't really care, and a major critic against the Thai monarchy, Andrew McGregor Marshall, was saying that because Facebook uses HTTP, so ISP can't block them. So as this reflects, clearly Facebook is playing dubious role as platform in the meantime, and also as publisher of data. So in the past, they have always abided by the role as platform that to avoid liability in connection with illegal content. But now with the prevailing of disinformation, it seems that it's clear that Facebook has been exerting clear content moderation policy when it comes to disinformation. They work with external network of fact checkers, and they have labeled false and distorted content, and also have passed a number of measures against curators and publishers of such content on the platform. And the measures ranges from refusing advertising and limit display of the content. And in case of repeated violations, there will be monetization of routes would be blocked, and the right to issue a new page to be restricted. Okay, this is in Thai. As you could see, how Facebook cooperated with AFP for fact checking and the flag and everything. In the meantime, Facebook and Twitter have taken quite a clear liberal left wing, if you like, and pro-democratic stance against information operation, IOs, and government propaganda, that kind of thing. And according to this news, they feel that they have found that there are a number of Facebook pages and Twitter accounts which are related to government information operation, and those have all been taken down and made public in this news. Okay. And as you know, Twitter has been very active in content moderation policy with regard to disinformation, focusing mainly on COVID, hate speech, government IOs, and election. Okay, and they have set up birdwatch system, which has been which has drawn quite a number of volunteers in Thailand as well. Okay, here's some birdwatch. Okay, this is my kind of last and sort of insight in context. It seems that the government attempt to censor content, through laws and notice and takedowns and IOs. Still, it is still a major concern for us in Thailand, and given the protracted political conflict, we have had this divisive political conflict for almost 20 years in Thailand. And with the pandemic control, which is not handled very well, government is being targeted by dissidents and pro-democracy demonstrators. And so, I mean, they are fighting back really hard, with laws and whatnot, as you could see. So under the circumstances, these global media platforms, with the stance, like I said, they're biased towards liberal, left-wing, democratic ideologies, and which make them become tilted, as publisher rather than platform, with their clear stance against IOs and government propaganda and all that. That's most welcomed by young users. And in that process, the way that these platforms are not being very transparent or very accountable in their handling of content moderation isn't being looked at, isn't being considered by a lot of users in Thailand, because for them the bigger fight is in taking the government down. So we don't really care if they're not transparent, because our bigger fight is that we need this platform as tools of liberation, in the fight against anti-democratic regime. Okay, so I guess the big miss here is that intermediaries need to be liable. It's not that we need them to be account for specific information, but they have to have in place processes of good data governance, and that mitigates against harm against human rights and intentional manipulation against users. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pirangrong. Thank you for explaining the situations in Thailand. That's very interesting. There are concerns of unintended surveillance and also violations of freedom of expressions rights within the discussion of intermediary liability and content moderation. Also interesting to understand that the social media platform has sort of like sided with the left wings in Thailand and being used as one of the tools to express democracy. Perhaps now I can check on the questions from the on-site participants. We can take one or two questions before we move on with the discussions. I see some of the questions online, very interesting discussion there as well. It's really hard to divide my concentration, but Amrita, Roxana, and Shita also answered some of the questions online already. So I think we can check on the on-site participants. Panitia, boleh dibantu? Ada yang mau tanya dari Bali? Anyone from Bali? Anyone in Bali wants to ask some questions? Yes? Nitya? Adakah? Kalau tidak, saya akan lanjutkan diskusinya dulu. Perhaps we can just move on with the discussion. I would like to come back to you, Roxana, as you have the front seat in this discussion. What are your views about the increasing power of the platforms? Because there are times of them to self-regulate, but what do you think are the roles expected from the companies? Because from the discussions, Shita, Amrita, and also Rongrong has mentioned a lot of power is also in the platforms and the companies themselves. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, thank you, Dinita, for giving me back the floor. Let me just say, well, two things. One, that there should be responsibilities on the platform, that going ahead without being in a position to hold accountable some of these actions by the platforms has proven us already that it's simply not working. So some action has to be taken. Now, how we define responsibilities and what type of responsibilities we should place on platforms is a very valid question. But I think we have moved away from thinking that platforms are simply hosting content without any sort of interference. It is not true. They have a lot of algorithms that are applied to the content that make certain content pop up higher up than other, that basically classifies in many different ways the kind of information available from users. So they are processing this data. It is not information that is simply posted without any interference. In that respect, they have responsibilities. Now, unfortunately, and this reflects also the conversation we had in the chat, platforms have been and continue to be extremely intransparent when it comes to how they operate. We still don't know exactly how many algorithms they use, what type of algorithms, what exactly are the parameters of these algorithms when it comes to how they look at the information. And even when it comes to human content moderation, we have a lot of leeway on certain decisions that we have not enough clarity about. So in that respect, I think there is a danger of over moderation, just because platforms tend to think AI is the solution to everything. Obviously, it's cheaper than employing people to do the job. The job is absolutely horrible to do, so nobody wants to do that job. It becomes really a closed circle. There are many options there. There is the danger of over moderation by relying extensively on automated tools. Then there's the censorship danger, that they will actually censor more content than needed just because they will want to avoid any legal problems whatsoever. And then there's also the danger of political influence, how much these platforms are actually giving in to some of the political bias and dynamics in a particular jurisdiction. We've seen it extensively with the US, but there is no reason not to point to other local situations in which leaders of platforms have negotiated directly with the president of the country or have been in bilateral discussions with the government. So we have seen all of these dangers manifesting somehow till now at different levels. We've seen anything from Facebook promoting hate speech and even leading to the loss of life, all the way to Zuckerberg running, a visit to a president. So all of these dynamics come together, unfortunately. And while I admit there isn't an easy solution for the platforms, I think it's time for them to actually endorse these responsibilities and provide more transparency. And we can only do that by pushing for them to be accountable. Unfortunately, the fear is that they will not do it on their own. But I also want to reflect another point that came from our discussion in the chat, and it was a very good observation when it comes to how regulation adds up to the responsibilities of the platforms, but not all platforms have enough resources to be able to pay for these increasing costs. It's true that only very large platforms can afford thousands of content moderators. Only they can afford to experiment with the latest AI tools that they generally have in-house. It's not the case for much smaller platforms. And to a certain extent, there is recognition of this huge difference in resources between smaller and bigger platforms. That's why a lot of regulators have created a special category of very large platforms with a high number of users and so on, because obviously the number of users is reflected in the revenues of those companies as well. So there is a danger there of blocking access to the market for the smaller platforms. It's a real danger. But I think because of the network effects, because people tend to be where their friends are and their relatives are and so on. And once you have such a huge footprint on a certain platform, it's very hard to move to another platform. So these changes are not really possible. Because of these dynamics, it makes sense to have more responsibilities on larger platforms. And it's, again, thinking of it in terms of public space. Some spaces are bigger than others, and we might have additional restrictions in place for those very large spaces. Thank you.
Thank you for the valuable insight, Roxana. Now I can go to Shita because I don't see any questions from the on-site. Shita, we would be very interested to hear your views about how platforms are regulating themselves in Indonesia, and what do you think are the roles expected from the companies here related to the regulations that we have now?
I think, in my point of view, most of the discussions of the content regulations or most of the discussions about social media governance is happening is either in New York or in Brussels. Yeah? So it's not really happening in these regions or in Indonesia in particular. So people starting to ask about the platform accountability when there was an accident of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, or when the Trump and there was a question from Trump administrations or after Trump administration from the Parliament of the US to Twitter and Mark Zuckerberg. So people are starting to realize on that. In my point of view, in my discussions with the Ministry of Communications, for example, it's very difficult for a country like Indonesia, though we have also large populations like India, to have a good negotiations with the platforms. Because most of the platforms will go towards what's happening in their own origin country in the US, or will bow down to the big countries, united countries like the European Union. So countries like in Asia or in Indonesia, it's a bit difficult to have a good conversations. I agree with Roxana on transparency and accountability. I think it's very important for the platforms or especially for the big platforms to provide transparency and accountability in their mechanism, in how they make decisions on the content moderations, in how they are deciding to take down specific account. We have in Indonesia many accounts being taken down. And some come from the request from the government. So but the point would be how do they make it, because it's part of their bread and butter, yeah. So they might not want to disclose the way they work, and I don't think transparency was also an easy terms, yeah, in terms of transparency, because transparency from the big platforms will be very complicated anyway. If they present the transparency report in like 100 pages, nobody would like to read it anyway on how they come to the decisions. So there is an issue. I agree on the transparency and accountability, but how to do it, that's something that we have to discuss further, because it's part of their bread and butter. Yeah. So that's also why I took these conversations in IGF Southeast Asia, because I think it's very important for us in this region to also discuss about social media governance. So it's not only happening in the north part of this globe. Yeah.
Thank you, Basita. I don't see any additional questions for now, so I will turn into Amrita. But first, Basita, thank you for highlighting the need to have a country-based discussion on platform accountability and liability, especially in countries where we have huge number of users such as India, Indonesia, and also Thailand. I remember some of our civil society friends in Myanmar are also attempting to have a policy conversation with Facebook, but it's really hard since all the decisions are being made in, the headquarters in New York and in other parts of the world. So Amrita, you mentioned several concerns about the new rules, but what do you think are the most concerning part, and how has the platform reacts to the new rules?
So the concerning parts are, for example, when, there are, for example, criminal liability comes into for a company's employees. Like, for example, there was a Twitter case wherein Twitter was asked to take down certain content, and they did not at that point of time, saying it is not as per their rules. And then the India government pointed out, like, look, you did the same thing in US, but you're not doing the same thing. The same rules are not applying here. And after a lot of tug of war, the content was taken down, and there were more content which was classified by the ruling power. Now, what happened is, in this case, the MD, someone filed the case, and the MD was made liable. Does the liability come with the MD? For example, the Twitter's office was, there was a search warrant, they went into the office. Simultaneously, Twitter, again, on another case, just took down content of a minister, which many feel should not have been taken down, as in that particular content. So, it's a very tricky situation, is who is right. While Twitter says the freedom of expression, right of speech should be there, the government wanting that, look, you are doing something else in US and you're not doing the same in India, is different. And then when Twitter is supposed to comply with the IT rules and they don't do it within a particular point of time, and they are sent reminders after a lot of nudging, now they are following. As in, when you have such a huge base, should you not follow the rules, or should you not give those intimations like, look, I will need so much of time before I can comply to the rules, wherein you know which was the deadline. So this is not a black and white situation. There are a lot of gray areas. But, in this entire conversation, for example, in content moderation, questions of freedom of speech, and like what Roxana mentioned, companies can proactively start filtering content. That is going to be, just to protect themselves. That's going to be something which we should be afraid of. Now, another thing which we need to think of is, okay, companies, when they want to do business, they will comply with the governments, and they'll start filtering, they will adhere to rules. But what happens to us individuals who want to post something? Where are our rights? For example, in India today, we do not have the data protection rules yet, or the privacy rules framed. So who takes care of my right? The government, will give a takedown notice. Facebook will take it down. But who holds whom accountable? What are the guardrails to protect government from not misusing power in terms of takedowns? And who is actually going to look at the power which is being given to the platforms to take down proactively monitoring content or something? So I think these are very hard questions to answer, but I think somewhere some balances will have to come. And I agree with Sheeta. If the companies are operating, and I'm not saying in large places where they have base, even say, for example, Fiji, if they have users, they should be liable to those citizens. They just can't say, okay, we follow US laws. It doesn't work that way. You can't be so hard hitting. So I think those, it will take time for these things to mature, but these are definitely tricky questions. But what happens to users and their rights is something which is very important.
Thank you, Amrita. Can I turn now to Pirongrong? We have questions from Shirley, but we can answer that after. I want to ask Pirongrong about what do you think about the trends of the regulations, especially as Amrita mentioned about the protections of digital rights. What are the roles expected from the companies, especially in Thailand?
Okay. Well, I think it's clear that platforms are not neutral in passing on content, and I don't expect them to be. If you read critical theory of technology, it's clear. All platforms are technologies, and they have built-in biases. So but it's still, it wouldn't be right not to expect accountability and transparency from them. I still think that the parameters of their algorithms should be made public. We should know how the algorithms are designed and what they are meant to achieve. I mean, that's clear transparency, but I don't think that black box will be unveiled to us quite soon. But I mean, but that's what that's what the citizens, but that's what civil society have to press against. And I totally agree with Amrita that what about our digital rights? What choice do people have? Over the content they might see, and we are being pushed around with these algorithms and the content moderation policy. So um, but still, if you take this to a more conceptual and theoretical level, you see the corporate logic, you see the cultural logic. The corporate logic, they want to avoid all kinds of litigation. So they would veer towards becoming platform. But in the meantime, there is a cultural logic. These platforms are democratic. I'm not siding with the big techs, but that's the culture of social media. So it's not an easy question, but as I said, there must be a way to mitigate harm. Still, you would want all these high tech and large platforms that are making billions of dollars, to be held accountable. And there should be some international mechanism to make that work. But I mean, that's where we're here for.
Yes, thank you, Pirongrong. I don't see any questions. Perhaps there's one question from Shirley about the transparency reports. I think this is the continuation from the previous conversation Roxana and Shirley also shared. Roxana, perhaps you want to answer that live?
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly that there is no standardized way of doing this report. So it's hard to compare them. It's absolutely true that we cannot compare these reports. Each company does it differently. They also report on different parameters, which is quite interesting. Some of them have more details about government requests coming to them, others little details. What I found actually was very problematic was the fact that the data was always presented in aggregated form, so you could not go to the details, you could not actually see which government has asked for what, and so on. You would only get the total. Same with AI tools, for example, we used in pre-screening content. We couldn't really see what kind of content, whether there was a human review of that content, and so on. So it tends to be really all high level, and we can't really go to the specifics. So it's really a pity. But I think this has to change, because for users to be able to make meaningful use of such transparency reports, we need to have the possibility of playing around with that data, of actually accessing it. And we've seen even recent attempts by platforms to limit the extent to which researchers can use data from this platform. So it's becoming extremely problematic. In the EU, with the Digital Services Act, this is actually prohibited. Platforms can no longer impose restrictions on researchers' access to data. But I would like this to really be also for the user, not just for the specific use of academics. It has to be for users as well. Unfortunately, it will take some sort of international coalition to be able to push for this, because even if countries might have specific requirements on what countries have to present in these reports, like Germany does, it has to also be monitored. And in Germany, a committee has found that some of the report was actually false. This kind of scrutiny is only available if there is a dedicated committee that only looks at these reports. And unfortunately, it means we cannot really trust the goodwill of platforms. It means we have to, have a way of checking, and that might be via the data provided, via just monitoring how these reports are done, and by just giving users the possibility to ask more questions when they see something in these reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. I just remember when you said there has to be someone who also monitor the self-regulation attempts from the platform. So Facebook have this oversight board, and then there are some groups that create the real oversight board, and it's very interesting to see their dynamics. There's one question for Pirongrong from Numi. So she says, does Thailand have its own platform like Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube? And there's one longer question for Professor Pirongrong. Initially, it is questions about how to solve the problem to allow people in different generations to come back to talk to each other with the platforms. Please, Pirongrong.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jompon, for that. Although I don't think I have a good answer for that. It seems people of different generations have taken over different platforms in Thailand. Facebook is for the older, and also Line. Line is a chat app, just like WhatsApp. It's very highly prevalent and popular in Thailand. So the older generation tend to take over Facebook and Line, whereas the younger generation have their own platform in Twitter. So I guess it's a huge, big echo chamber we are talking about. You know, they're just talking among themselves, hearing things they want to hear, and socializing with like-minded people. So I don't have a good answer because and also journalism is going down the drain. You know, the central intermediary that should be working for the interest of the people, for the public, are not doing that job.
I also don't have any answers to that, but anyone wants to jump in, like how to solve these generational problems? Amrita, perhaps?
As in, generation problems will stay. Okay, so I think there would be certain, if we are looking at platforms, irrespective of different, what kind of age group people are using it from, there would be specific problems which will be same in each of them. For example, the accountability, if you are reporting an issue, how long it takes to resolve it, if at all it will resolve, or how do you escalate as a user. So those are certain issues which always remain for all platforms, irrespective of, you know, where you are using it. Do actually people know how to report it? Is it easy? For example, today you try to report an issue. Please try and see how easy or how hard it is for us to report an issue or even follow up. Is it easy for people? And we're talking about people from, say, old people or young people. How can they report it? How can they, you know, there are tools, but is it easy to find out? And then there would be specific platform related issues. So I think it is easier to take the broader issues and then look at it. For example, different platforms having different governance structures. I think there has to be more conversation amongst users or civil society on what these issues are, because many people, for example, rural areas of Indonesia or even rural areas of India, I'll take these examples because these are easier for me. People really don't know what to do if there is an issue. If there is a morphed picture of a girl, she doesn't even know how to report it. She needs to know how to report it. And these are glaring issues which keeps on coming. A boyfriend and a relationship turns sour. The boy posts pictures about the girl really doesn't know how to take it down. And once it's up, if it is not taken down very soon, it is going to be there somewhere online. So these are tricky issues. And I think capacity building amongst users as to how to use, what their rights are online is very important. And this is something which companies have to invest in, governments have to invest in, and perhaps driven by civil society, because they understand how it is driven. And I think it's a huge issue, but these may be some ways. There has to become, capacity building amongst users of what their rights are, how to use platforms, how safe it is to, for example, today every child knows how to cross the street because it has been built into them. Look, if there's a red light, you don't cross. This is where you can cross. But if you don't have those kind of rules told to new users, they just believe, for example, they just believe anything which comes to them and they send it to people. Like, you'll have messages coming like, there is kidney available, please, if someone wants, please share. But they don't understand that kidneys cannot be given that way. And people are sharing it as a social good. That's the challenge.
Thank you, Amrita. We have a questions from Matt Nguyen. He said, it seems that states do not have appropriate international levers on these issues and thus are retreating to national legislations. What kind of governance structure do you see as emerging are needed to deal with these issues? I see Shita is also answering. Shita, would you like to take it on online?
Yeah, actually, I learned this from Roxana's book, Negotiating Internet Governance. So in my point of view, also in my conversations, in my learning process, there was a time when international forums such as Internet Governance Forum was seen as an avenue for multi-stakeholder and international discussions on this internet issue, which is very complex and needs a different set of skills from technical point of view, from civil society, for academicians, from the governments. But I don't think it is really doable now. I think in the discussions that we had, many countries are trying to do it on their own. I like what Roxana has mentioned about DSA, the Digital Service Act in the European Union. I think there was also UK coming out with its own regulations, Canada with its own regulation, intermediate liability regulations. There is also Singapore or Germany. So many countries are trying to do it on their own. I think I would like to borrow what Amrita was saying. The government would like the platforms to follow the laws of the land. Yeah. So you are servicing our community or servicing our public, then you have to follow our rules. I think there's also an issue of sovereignty. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether we can go back to the international forum. I'm not sure whether international forum is a good place to start because the process is very long. I know that the UN has this United Nations digital partnership. I forgot
That
it
is the cooperation, right? Yeah.
Yeah, digital cooperations. But I don't know how far it has gone, and I don't know whether it is a really good mechanism to ensure that all the countries or all the nations, either regional or national, are working together. Because it's not only the platforms or the companies that has own agenda. Yeah? Government also has their own agenda, and they would like to for all the companies to work on what their terms. So yeah.
Thank you, Shita. Amrita, yes.
I just want to add out here that there are certain things, the issues which are specific to the country, and then the governments can take those decisions. However, the challenge is in the cross-jurisdictional area, and that is where the gray area is. Whose rules will, if someone may say, okay, my rules go, someone may say my rules go. So that is where perhaps the global digital cooperation or anyone, though nothing has happened out there, but some kind of the governments can come and talk. But again, if you look at the geopolitics today, the conversations or the way things will be framed will be very skewed, as in there would be certain powers who will try to drive the conversations towards them. It can be anyone from Asia, it can be anyone from the big powers can kind of try to drive the conversation. So what happens to the other nations? And that's something which happens even in the UN if you look at the multilateral, discussion forums. So I think the cross-jurisdictional area, because many of the rules which are coming up are cross-jurisdictional. It's not within their countries. So, and it's, I would say ideally GDPR and the privacy regime started with that, and others are kind of following in that process, not intermediate liability, but in the privacy case. But again, this is moving that way. So I don't know, we have to wait and watch in that sphere. And at this moment, there is no global conversation per se happening. There are many new platforms discussed, multilateral forums or others who are discussing issues, edge issues on these, but I really don't know. Roxana, if you have some ideas, I don't know.
Roxana, would you like to chime in?
I have nothing to add to what Amrita said. I perfectly agree with you. We need a global conversation. We are lacking this clearinghouse for all of these concerns to come together. And there was this hope that maybe the IGF Plus, the global IGF, could be, in an extended version, could be the forum to do this next, take forward some of the recommendations of the digital cooperation high-level panel that the UN Secretary General has put together. I think we're still waiting to see whether that is going to happen, but it would be good to revive the IGF with more of the practical approach and really actions that can come out of it. But I think we are still missing, the clear scope of what this work should be. And even in this conversation today, we've seen there are so many different aspects to take into account when it comes to platform that unless we clear this out before, it's hard to take them to a forum and actually expect that it's going to do more than just discussion. But we're on the right track, I would say.
Thank you. We have members of the multi-stakeholders advisory group here, so hopefully the advices can be discussed at the Global IGF. Sadly to say, we are at the end of our discussion. Before we bring this panel discussion to a close, I would like to give our panelists 1 minute each to pull the strands together and offer their final closing remarks, especially on the intermediary liability and social media governance. Perhaps we can start with P. Rongrong and then go to Amrita, Roxana, and Mbak Shita at the end. P. Rongrong, please.
Well, just quickly and briefly, like I said, I follow with the mainstream accountability, transparency, and also international mechanism, which we still await for them to hold the big tech platform accountable.
Thank you. Amrita, please.
Interesting times. We'll see more in this debate, and let's see how it moves.
Thank you. Roxana.
Let me just add a note on users being given more power. I think that's what we need next in these discussions, that the users also have possibilities of challenging these decisions by platforms and being consulted when certain policies are drawn that affect them.
Absolutely agree. Mbak Shita, please.
Yeah, as a person who initiated this session, I would say that internet intermediate liability is not an easy subject, and it will keep growing. What I have seen is that the discussions on internet intermediate liability is also growing. When one country, even authoritarian country, coming out with the regulations, many international organizations can have a say. It depends whether the government will listen or not. It depends on the context of the government. But there are many international conversations around this. Yeah. So when each country like Singapore or Germany or Canada or UK, there always a discussion around it. So I think it's better for us in Asia to also keep in touch on that, to be part of the discussions, so that we can have perhaps some approach that really can be across jurisdiction in Asia. Amrita, might not be in global, but in Asia.
That's a good spot. Brilliant conversation. Thank you, everyone. I apologize if we were unable to take your questions. Thanks to our wonderful panel as well for joining and sharing their invaluable insights on this topic. Thank you for taking the time and be with us here today. It is good to have this conversation, and hopefully there are a lot of insights that you can also get from these sessions. Thanks to the participants who joined the sessions. We appreciate your time. Just to remind you that we still have numerous interesting sessions at the IGF tomorrow, so please check the agenda. I am formally closing the session now. Please stay safe, get your vaccines if you can, and I wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you also, Leah, for the very great moderation.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you all. Bye.
Welcome, Amrita. It's a very good discussion. I would like to say thank you for Ria as well for being a very
great moderator,
excellent moderator.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of questions. I'm saving the chat because there's a lot of information there as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.